And now we welcome Mr. Daniel Speckhard, President and CEO at Chorus International, former U.S. Ambassador to Greece and Belarus, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General at NATO, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Iraq. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us at TVP World.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So we have watched, we've had more attacks coming from Russia this week, which have included cluster munitions, which is obviously very tragic, but also very controversial. Can we expect more escalation from Ukraine now that it has been receiving more support from the US? There is increased support from the EU and other European countries.
Well, I would expect that the Ukrainians are going to try to respond to some of the Russian attacks. At the same time, I think there is a hope among many, including humanitarian organizations like my own, that we try to avoid the cluster munitions that have been used by Russia and have been delivered to Ukraine in the past. I think for right now, what Ukraine needs to be focusing on is being able to hold the line and be able to resist further efforts by Russia to take additional territory and improve its position on the battlefield. In the end, though, my experience, a long time in international affairs, is these kind of attacks that Russia is taking on civilian populations and civilian infrastructures have a counter effect to their long-term objective, right? It creates further resistance, further resilience and insurgency and counter strikes. My hope is that it doesn't expand into Russian territory because I don't think that will be advantageous to anyone. But clearly the war is going to shift a little bit with the additional resources coming into Ukraine.
Right, and I would like to further discuss these additional resources. We're talking about the almost 61 billion aid package from Washington to Ukraine. And in one of the lines, it does include the transfer of long-range attack missiles. Now, a lot of people are speculating what that actually means in practice, as the United States did repeatedly tell Ukraine not to hit within Russian lines, but at the same time giving them the tools capable of doing so. Does that signify that U.S. is letting off on that stance?
You know, I can't speak for the U.S. government because I'm no longer in it. But what I can say is that changes a little bit the calculation, I would assume, on the Russian side when they have these capabilities. Ukraine has tried to be very careful from what I've seen, and when it has attacked sites in Russia, that it's focused on military sites that are directly connected to the engagement of the war. So I would assume that these weapons would be considered potentially threatening by Russia on the context of its logistical supply lines and military lines as they come to execute the war. And of course, any military man will tell you if you can stop those resources from getting to the front lines before they're there, that's advantageous. Again, though, I think the U.S. would be wise to continue to advise Ukraine to avoid overreaching in terms of taking the war to Russian territory.
We know that this aid package has come through. However, it won't last that long, if we are to be absolutely honest. And now the focus in the US will be on the elections. And there have been suggestions in the media that now President Biden will be refocusing on other issues, perhaps that are more important to US election campaign strategy as opposed to this foreign policy. How do you think that will, how do you think President Biden will be focusing, what will he be focusing on now that this Ukraine issue has temporarily been resolved, shall we say?
Well, you're right. There is some question on longer-term support for Ukraine, given politics in the United States and in Europe. But I think what we should take away from this is that in spite of actually the world being a bit absorbed with what's going on in the Middle East, they were still able in the United States in a highly politicized and polarized environment to pass with bipartisan support this package of support to Ukraine. So I think the Russians have underestimated the resilience of the United States and Europe as it relates to supporting Ukraine. It's hard to predict the future, But I think what this particular event told me is that there's a lot more latent support than you see just by what you read in the newspapers or in the media. And the fact that you were able to pass a package like this in the midst of what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East, which is consuming so much domestic attention in the United States, tells me that there is a great deal still of resilience in the United States system and Europe in ensuring that Ukraine gets the support it needs to continue its fight.
Right, and when we look at the passing of this support package within the U.S. House of Representatives, like you said, it's been passed with a significant bipartisan support. However, we dive deep into the number, and again, like you mentioned, it's not as significant as those in the Middle East. Do you think that is a litmus test of where the direction of this so-called war fatigue is kicking in? In other words, are you a glass half full person or a glass half empty person?
Well, I'm just the glass is half, right? I can't say full or empty because the reality is it is difficult, right? It's difficult to sustain support for a foreign war, even when it's so egregious what's happening to the Ukrainians, when you have your own challenges in your own countries. And we see that across Europe and the United States. At the same time, I think what people underestimate as they look to the future is you're assuming whatever stays the same for Russia stays the same, meaning that there aren't surprises for Russia as well on its own territory and its own challenges, economic, security, political, and so forth. And while Putin is an autocratic leader, he cannot control all the circumstances in a country that large and that big, and what happens on the borders of his territory, and what happens in some of the other foreign interventions that they've already been involved in. So there's a lot of things that could still also upset the Russian dynamic on this side and change their equation in terms of their ability to prosecute this war.
And as we slowly wrap up, I wanted to ask about your role as senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and obviously as president and CEO at Chorus International. You obviously focus on Ukraine and supporting Ukraine beyond that context of war. What are your recommendations? Because you recently had a conference I saw on your website.
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing as we're thinking about beyond the war, obviously, infrastructure is the number one key for the country. It's been so damaged. So people beginning to plan post-war recovery is essential. It's essential that it happens early and that it continues to get developed and updated, primarily with Ukrainians in the lead, right? That's where we've made mistakes in the past as the international community as you try to do this from the outside. This is going to be a Ukrainian effort. And while it's premature now to start that, given that their infrastructure keeps getting hit, that's this number one thing. Two or three other things, though, I hope people will think about. One is don't forget the most vulnerable people. When we work, the work that we're doing at the front lines of Ukraine, providing humanitarian assistance, it's mostly elderly, disabled, and people who cannot leave that area. And there are so many of those people. And that's going to only expand because of the number of injured and wounded people from the war that are now disabled. Remembering the vulnerable parts of the society is going to be important as they move forward. And the last piece is psychological trauma. I think it's hard to overestimate the damage that has been done to the generation that is and generations that are living there now in terms of psychological trauma, and that can really undermine the development and progress of a country's future. And I'm hoping that the international community will put a lot of attention on ensuring that they support the mental health of a population that's just been so dramatically traumatized.
Okay, Daniel Speckhard, President and CEO at Chorus International, thank you so much for joining us today at TVP World.
Thank you.